So firstly, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in to the start of our Spatial Insider Webinar Series. We are very excited to be bringing the agenda for us for this webinar series is to really bring together some of the world's experts in the area of spatial data, in the area of maps in general, and really just share what is it and how is it that some of the world's best companies are going about investing in maps and how they look at spatial data. So for the very first webinar in this series, we are super excited to be hosting Naveen. Naveen, and I'll let him introduce himself more, but Naveen leads one of the most exciting teams at Uber. He'll touch upon his background, how is it that Uber looks at maps, what are some of the areas they've invested in, how they think about some of this. We'll also touch upon some of the technical aspects of the platform. So yeah, firstly, Naveen, thank you so much for joining. Super excited to have you here.
Yeah, same here. I'm actually equally excited to be here to share the learnings that I've gotten through my experience at Uber with the community. And mapping is a very close-knit community, so I'm super excited to be here. I'm actually looking forward to all the questions that audience will have.
Awesome. So maybe just to kick things off, would love to know a little bit more about you, Naveen, which is, maybe just share a little bit about your background. What is it that you do at Uber? So would love to sort of get to know you better.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an engineering manager at Uber, where I've led multiple teams in maps and marketplace organizations within Uber. In maps specifically, I've led the navigation team and mapping APIs. So navigation is your typical turn-by-turn navigation solution, but it is deeply integrated into Uber's application so that drivers don't have to go outside of the app. So I was leading the entire end-to-end experience for navigation. And we launched globally during my tenure there, going across all the platforms, across iOS and Android, across all the countries as well. And I also managed the mapping APIs team, which are responsible to power the ETAs and the routes that you see in your Uber app. So the black route line that you see, that is powered by these services in the Uber app. So obviously, this had a lot of challenges in terms of scale. We were serving about tens of billions of queries per day. Prior to this, I was at mostly in the enterprise search space, working at Salesforce and at a search startup in Singapore before that.
Awesome. And maybe, again, just a little bit about, how you feel about the work you do. I know maps is not something which, as a function, a lot of at least other consumer internet style companies have, or even enterprise companies. So apart from it being sort of this, exotic-ish technical discipline, could you share what is it that you find exciting about working on maps?
Yeah, maps, it's exciting because it's a very integral part of the Uber's puzzle that basically seamlessly bridges the physical and digital world. That's what excites me. Maps, if you think about it, this is the first time I can take the algorithm that I learned in college and apply them in the real world. Right? So originally, when I was interviewing with Uber, I was looking at the search teams and I was talking to them, but I accidentally met with a few maps folks, and I was really intrigued by the problems that they were trying to solve. Right? It's something that I've never seen in my experience prior to Uber. When you build a new feature or you put out a bug fix, you can actually see the impact in the real physical world immediately in your next trip. Right? So that's what energized me about mapping.
Yeah, and I can relate. I remember my sort of algorithms 101 reading about Dijkstra and graph theory. So yeah, I completely sort of understand, the opportunity to apply all that in a real world setting. And maybe actually that's a good segue to, I think one of the topics which I'm really hoping to address in this in our chat is, maps is not just a technical, cool and challenging discipline to work on, but that it really drives user experience and business and just business dollars in a major way, right? So maybe starting at a 30,000 feet level, could you share more about the role that maps in general plays at Uber? Obviously, all of us we open the app and we see, hey, there's a map there, right? Drivers open the app, they see there's a map there. But beyond that, what is the role that maps plays at Uber?
Yeah, maps is if you think about it, maps is front and center of everything we do at Uber. Right? It helps the users pick the select the pickup and drop off location as soon as you open the app, right? It helps you determine like the time of arrival for the driver to pick you up, right? So it drives pretty much every experience from the moment you open the app until you complete the trip. Every step of the trip flow or delivery flow is influenced by maps, and the decision making is influenced by maps, right? Um, so it also influences a lot of decision making, and how Uber efficiently runs the business behind the scenes is also driven by some of these mapping services, right? An interesting stat I want to share with you all is typical drivers or couriers, when they're driving for Uber or any ride sharing company, they spend about 2/3 of their time navigating uh, when they're online. So that is a huge surface area or touch point. And if a company like Uber or any ride sharing company or delivery company can get that experience right, and make it as efficient and as stress free, for example, for the driver, then it leads to huge, like magical experiences, how I call it. Right? It can have, and then when you have magical experience, it automatically translates to business impact. So in that sense, Maps is a very critical part of how Uber operates.
I remember, one of my previous jobs, we did the same sort of analysis for, the consumer experience. And what we found there was, I think before placing an order or booking a ride, something like 60% of touch points or interactions with the app had maps, linked to it in one way or another. So yeah, I mean, I didn't realize this statistic about drivers as well. So maybe, again, moving to the next topic, which is obviously, there are plenty of mapping providers, out there in one way or another. There's Google, obviously ones like Google Mapbox, but there are like a bunch of others as well. But I know that, ride sharing companies, delivery companies such as, obviously Uber, Lyft, Didi, and many more, they've all invested in a big way in maps, right? Like some of you guys have like multi-hundred member teams. People have made acquisitions. Uber has made them, Lyft has made them, Didi has made them, Meituan has made them. So why invest, so much in maps? Why do you think these companies are doing it? And why is it that just, using Google Mapbox or whatever that is, why is that just, not good enough?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question. That's something we keep asking ourselves as well. But if you think about it, like there are various reasons, like each company might have its own reasons. But if you think about it, like all of these apps, the user experience is deeply integrated with maps. So the companies might want to optimize that experience, right? The second one is obviously these are global companies and they're operating at a massive scale. And they make a lot of business decisions based on some of the output that mapping provides, right? So that's another reason. And finally, like these companies might have its own unique use cases that traditional mapping providers may not support, right? For example, like if you think about traditional mapping providers until now, they've been built for a consumer context. That is, there is one user going from point A to point B, and they generally don't care about what the user does at the pickup or destination, right? They let the user figure out once they get to the destination, they go somewhere, right? But from a ride sharing or delivery context, generally these trips involve multiple waypoints, right? The driver is going from their location to pick up and drop off. And it generally involves multimodal trips as well. Like a trip can involve a bike, a transit, or a car, traditional car, right? So there's a multimodal trip is a very common use case. And finally, the users have to perform certain actions at each of these waypoints, right? Like picking up the passenger at the right side of the street, right? Or delivering food. It's not just going to the destination, but you actually get off and deliver the food. So because of these use cases, all of these use cases may not be sufficiently supported in traditional mapping provider because they've been built for other purposes in the past, mostly for traditional consumer use cases. So I feel like because of these reasons and probably many more, companies started to invest over time in their own custom mapping technologies.
Yeah, and I remember a term we used to use was deliveries, for example, is not door to door or street to street. It is really counter to couch, as an example, where you really are trying to pick up food from the restaurant, walk to your bike or whatever car, drive, park, walk over, deliver the food, pretty much right where the consumer is sitting on his or her couch, as an example. So and maybe, so obviously these companies and obviously Uber as well, made so many investments. Maybe could you share some examples or some specific examples or touch points where problems that you were able to solve which were not possible otherwise, or which areas led to, let's say, a fair amount of customer impact or business impact or something. Yeah, I mean, just to make this more concrete and real.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think having your custom solution will help you show the most contextual and accurate information to the user, right? The traditional mapping providers may or may not provide. What I mean by take food delivery, for example, like you mentioned, right, from counter to couch, right? Whenever there is a food delivery, the driver not just goes to a particular destination, they park the car. They need to find parking first place, and they're probably walking to deliver food at the door front, right? But a traditional mapping provider might think that the ETA for the driver to drop off the food is as soon as they reach the waypoint that is map matched to the road segment. Right? They may not consider the parking or the waiting time. Right. So then you're promising the eater that the food will arrive in 10 minutes, but it might take actually like 20 minutes for them to park and drive. So that leads to bad experiences if you're not considering those last mile ETS, if you will, right? So that's one use case that I can think of that you need to solve for. And take another example that comes to mind is airports or even venues, right? At airports, traditional ride-sharing drivers have to go to a designated spot for pickup and drop-offs. However, like if you use traditional mapping providers, they will probably navigate you to the departure gate or the arrival gate, right? But if you have a custom mapping solution that helps drivers and riders get to the rendezvous point seamlessly, then that's a huge win, right? That's magical experience again, where you are basically reducing the wait time for the driver or the rider, or even like reduce trip cancellations because there is a long wait time. That the worst case, what happens, the rider might cancel the trip. So these are some specific use cases where like having custom mapping tech could solve.
Yeah, and I mean, I imagine like wait times, cancellations. So if you're saying like these are the metrics that are impacted, like that's pretty much at the heart of a ride sharing or a delivery or I guess any transport logistics experience. So and maybe like asking a slightly different flavor of this problem, which is and this is obviously unique to some of these sort of global companies, which is obviously Uber operates in a whole bunch of different geographies. So would you say there are some sort of unique, hyper local type problems, or that again you were able to solve? So maybe an example of something along those lines that you were able to do as a result of having, say, an in-house platform, or maybe more broadly, how much of this customization do you have to do maybe across geographies, or you're able to serve everything through sort of like a unified platform?
Yeah, no, I think the country wise or geography it does vary, right? It depends on the use case also. In some use cases they may not vary, but in some use cases it will vary, right? For example, there might be some countries where you take India, for example. The navigation is very different from a traditional navigation like in the market like US, right? Like where in India, generally, like you have a lot of POI based navigation, like you turn right at this particular mall or something like that. So I think that navigation solutions can vary from geography to geography, and the way drivers prefer to drive also like varies a lot. For example, right, in some countries, driver would probably prefer taking the freeways as much as they can, just so that it is stress free. But in some other cultures, they might prefer the fastest route, even if that means going through a lot of like inner alleyways. So I think you need to really understand what kind of preferences that driver have and just your route, so that the routes that you generate ultimately needs to be preferred by the drivers and what the riders like. Right. So it's hard to say there's like one answer globally because there's a lot of cultural differences. There's a lot of map data differences between countries and various like there's millions of factors that come into play.
Yep, makes sense. And maybe actually there's an interesting question which maybe we can take after the next one, which talks about why build like products like ETAs and sort of matching, but why not build something like Tiles where Uber seems to use Google Maps. So we'll come to this question after, but maybe one of the things this question refers to is the fact that you've invested, fair bit in, ETAs, routing, navigation tech, map matching, etc. So, and obviously this is an area you lead personally. So yeah, could you share a little bit about maybe some examples from ETAs and routing, and maybe just the kind of role it plays? Some examples of how, what are some of the challenges you've solved, or use cases or business ROI you've enabled specifically from, say, some of the ETAs routing type efforts?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, like mapping in general has a huge impact on the user experience. And then within that, ETAs and routes play a pretty big role, right? Like from the moment you open the app, ETA and route is computed to tell you how far is the driver to pick you up, right? And as the trip progresses, we continuously want to make sure that the driver's progress is up to date, and we want to show the most up to date ETA and route line, right? So, and then behind the scenes also, like these are used to like Uber uses these ETS and routes to efficiently plan the user's journey across many users, so that overall the marketplace is efficient, right? So in that sense, it's super critical. Even if you take, in general, like mapping providers need to provide as accurate ETS as possible, right? But in a delivery or ride sharing context, this becomes even more critical because you are showing to the rider about the driver's ETA, right? For example, if you promise that the driver is going to arrive in 10 minutes, but the driver actually arrives in, let's say, 20 minutes. So that means that the rider is waiting for 10 extra minutes. And this could lead again, like the rider contacting the driver, or even like worst case, like even canceling the ride. That could lead to bad experience and business impact. And on the other side, if he promises the driver is going to arrive in 10 minutes, but they actually arrive within 5 minutes, right? So then that could also lead to bad experience because the driver is probably waiting at a busy intersection for 5 extra minutes, and they might cancel, and their rating could be impacted, or even your overall marketplace efficiency could be impacted. I think having accurate ETAs and a route that is preferred by the drivers is very critical, not only for an efficient marketplace, but also to drive these magical experiences so that you improve the user satisfaction and user retention in the long term. So that you build the trust with the system, right? Like otherwise, if it is not trustworthy, then they may not even come back to your platform.
Yeah, makes sense. I think I'm sure all of us taking these rides have had these issues that and completely relate to, ordering a cab and then the driver not arriving, or the food arriving cold. And I mean, your insight on obviously why ETAs and routing are super critical is obviously very pertinent here. So maybe we'll take up the first question from the audience here. The question here is, it seems Uber has built a few internal products around ETAs, map matching, let's say like broadly road network related. But why is it that Uber still uses map tiles from Google, and why not, build products like map tiles yourself?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and obviously I can't share like the internal details why the decision making behind this. But what I can share is we constantly look at from a customer perspective, right? And what use case we're trying to solve for, right? So, and then we try to choose the best solution that we can give to the customer. So for some use cases that Uber has, or even like traditional other ride sharing companies might have, the existing solutions may not fit the bill, in which case we might want in-house solutions. But in some other cases, maybe we are better off using a third party, right? So you as a company, or you as your mapping expert in the company, you need to decide for your use cases whether you want to build or you want to use a third party provider. And it's all like a very, very contextual. There's no one right answer here.
Makes sense. And then I guess there's another question on ETAs. Maybe let's just take this one and then we'll move on, which is, how do you plan for better ETAs for food delivery versus a ride-hailing context? So what would you say, sort of the difference and how you approach these two problem statements?
Yeah, so I think at the crux of it, it's not very different. Ultimately, there are multiple waypoints, and you're trying to figure out what's the best route and ETA, right? So there's a lot of mapping conditions, real like traffic condition that you take into consideration, and then figure out what's the best ETA. However, at the pickup and drop off points, and that's where the experience differs, right? As you can see from the app, like the delivery driver might have more tasks to do than a ride sharing driver, right? At the pickup and drop off. For example, like food delivery, parking is a very important aspect, or even walking directions to the door front is very important. However, for ride hailing, for example, there is no parking or walking concept, but you have to give them the right side of the street and also a safe spot for them to stop and pick up the passengers. So that's where I think uh, at the waypoints itself, where they need to take action, I think that's where you need the differences start coming into picture, and you need to adjust your solutions to that.
Well, yeah, so clearly, I think we're getting quite a few sort of fairly technical questions. So maybe, we'll come back to the next set of questions after, but, maybe for some of the more technically inclined folks in the audience, and I know there are quite a few. So maybe touching upon some, slightly different set of topics. I know Uber has talked very publicly in a lot of webinars and videos and blog posts about sort of the scale and it operates, and just I guess just a lot of technical challenges you've solved. So maybe touching upon a couple of these things, which is, could you share something, whatever you can share about sort of the scale at which your platform operates, and some maybe some challenges that come with the kind of scale you try to deliver your mapping solution at, which wouldn't, or companies in the audience who are sort of in a similar growth phase, they might face as they scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So Uber does about 21 million trips per day, right? So this is a number before the pandemic hit us. And for each trip, obviously, Uber map services play various different roles. Like it helps you set the pickup and drop off locations. It gives driving directions to the user, to the driver, and it gives you the ETA and route for pickup and drop off and as it progresses. So these 21 million trips obviously translate to a large number of calls to mapping services in the order of tens of billions of requests per day, right? And there will be some use cases that are very latency sensitive because it enables Uber to make decisions in real time in order to plan the user's journey, right? So handling such low latencies at such scale is one of the biggest challenges we face, right? One thing I do want to highlight that at Uber scale, or even like at global scale or any like country level scale, optimizing the mapping experience or even like improving the ETA accuracy by, let's say, a small percentage can have a direct impact on your business metrics. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that to have that bridge between your ETA metrics and how it has impact on the business metrics.
Yeah, so a shameless plug on a different point. I actually wrote a blog post on exactly this point, which is why ETA accuracy, how should you measure this, and sort of the impact it can drive to your business. But yeah, I mean that's shameless plug aside. So I think moving to the next point, which is, I guess, obviously, I mean, from a technology standpoint, scale is obviously one of the most interesting challenges. But maybe, obviously, building maps is sort of fairly multidimensional. So again, sticking to the sort of technical theme here, but could you share some other interesting technical challenges you've had to face, which maybe is unique to the kind of problems you're trying to solve, or just anything else unique to a particular business? Just some other very interesting but very challenging technical problem you have to solve as part of building this platform.
Yeah. One example that I generally like to share is in a mapping context, like GPS, having a noisy or weak signal of GPS is a very common problem, right? So most of, especially in urban tunnels where there are like tall buildings around you, or when you're at a multi-level freeway interchange, most of you using traditional mapping solutions might have experienced this, where you see unnecessary reroutes or there's a laggy behavior in your navigation when this happens. However, the problem gets exaggerated in a ride sharing or delivery context, because what is happening in the real world, you're trying to show that to the rider as well, which is an entirely different user. So even if you improve the client side functionality for the GPS on driver's mobile phone, you still want to build a mapping technology so that the riders or eaters have a very consistent and accurate view of what's happening in the real world. Right. So this is a very interesting challenge that typically these kind of companies would face. Um, and one other thing I want to add is like Uber or any ride sharing or delivery companies are like three-sided marketplace. That there is a rider, there's a driver, and Uber itself is one of the users in the marketplace, right? Um, so when you have the multiple users, your aim should be so that all the users in the marketplace have a very consistent view of what's happening in the real world. And that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest challenges that these companies would face.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I imagine this is exactly why all of us have seen the situation where our Uber drivers arriving to pick us up. There's a black line there that says, "Hey, this is what this is the route that the driver is going to follow." But then the driver takes a different turn, and you're like, "Hey, what are you doing?" So yeah, I'm sure all of us can relate to the importance of ensuring sort of, I guess, everyone in the ecosystem is in sync.
Yeah.
So yeah, okay, great. So I think maybe we take sort of another question first before moving on. So the next question is, so maybe the way we do this question is sorry, give me a minute. Yeah, so I guess the next question is about surge pricing. So since we're focusing here on maps, maybe could you share a little bit about how some of the mapping tech interfaces with surge pricing? Again, yeah, whatever you could share. I imagine some of this is fairly proprietary.
Yeah, this is definitely Uber's secret sauce, right? So, but if you think about it, like surcharge in general happens when in any two-sided market when there is demand and supply, and when the demand is more than the supply, right? Supply is obviously your Uber drivers, demand is the number of ride requests that are happening. So I think in that is the essence of how surcharge is completed. And maps, I think it plays a very similar role in a very traditional like a trip, or if there is a surcharge. Like from a mapping perspective, that doesn't change much because you're still trying to give them, okay, what is the best ETA, what is the best route, and then you're trying to make a globally optimal solution for the company itself. Sorry, I don't know if that was a non-answer, but I hope that is useful for whoever asked that.
Yeah, I remember like in the early days, like, I mean, I guess surge pricing has always been such a hot potato topic. Yeah, I think every sort of city government probably around the world has opinions on it. Every person who's experienced surge pricing has an opinion on it. Yeah, I can see. So, why everyone would be interested. So maybe moving on, we'll take more questions after. But so, I guess for companies in the audience or people who are sort of, operating in different spheres of ride hailing or just transportation, logistics, deliveries. Obviously, as we've discussed, maps is pretty important to all of them. So I guess, but obviously not everyone is as sophisticated or anywhere near as sophisticated as Uber is in terms of some of this. So what would you, advise people to say, hey, who are still on the fence about investing in maps, or maybe, thinking about, hey, this seems interesting. Hey, there seem to be a lot of other companies doing something. Maybe I should figure this out. But, is Google Mapbox not enough? Hopefully this webinar has already answered some of those questions. But what would be your advice on how should they get started?
Yeah, so I think there's no right answer here, right? So it really depends on the use cases that the company is trying to build for, right? Like what they're trying to optimize for in their business. Like it also depends on the scale that they're operating at, right? And what stage they're at in terms of the product and rollout and scale. So the reason I say that is the level of investment you will have to make can vary drastically from whether you're building from scratch, the number of customized use cases you have, versus building on top of existing solutions out there, right? So you got to do your due diligence here, and you got to do that due diligence recurring on a recurring basis, right? Like because map solutions are evolving as we go, and your company's business use cases will evolve as you go. So you got to have that constant conversation within your organization to see, okay, what solutions are out there, what should we build on our own versus not. But I will give a fair warning that investing in a mapping tech is a very big undertaking, right? Because it's a very deep domain. You need to have very in-depth understanding of the mapping stack. But more importantly, you need to understand the nuances or the intricacies that you have to deal with, both in the digital world, but a lot in the physical world, because real life conditions are changing every second. Traffic conditions change, road closures. So you need to be able to understand like there's a real physical world aspect to it. And finally, you need domain expert to be able to solve this, and that is again like hard to get right. So before investing, I would say like do your due diligence and make sure you have answers to all these questions, and then decide for yourself whether that's something you want to build versus leverage existing technologies.
Great. Yeah, I think I feel, as somebody working on maps as well, that it's often underappreciated how sort of how much of a technical discipline this is. So like how much sort of prior experience helps. But yeah, could sort of hear you say the same. So there's one question in the audience, and it's anyway a topic I wanted to pick your brain on, which is on OpenStreetMaps. It comes from an anonymous attendee as well. But obviously, we can't talk about maps and not talk about OpenStreetMaps. It's obviously been something which has had a lot of promise for many years. Uh, what is sort of your opinion on building on top of, say, OSM, OSRM, Graph and sort of other open source tech versus trying to do something more proprietary? So what again would be your opinion on this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. So OSM in general is a very it's a very good community, right? It has like millions of contributors globally, and it's a great resource if for ride sharing or delivery companies if they want to bootstrap their mapping journey, right? Um, because they have like OSM plus OSRM. You get some solutions for ETAs and routes out of the box. However, like OSM, like any other open source technology, it faces the same issues like reliability or freshness of data, or even like coverage of data. Like, so you need to do again your due diligence whether for the markets that you operate in, OSM is able to have that coverage. And for ETA or route computation, the level of accuracy that you need for your business, does OSM plus OSRM meet that accuracy levels that you want, right? So once you do that due diligence, you will understand like how much effort you need to put in and the level of investment you need to have, and also figure out ways to contribute back to the community. But in general, like my advice would always be to leverage existing solutions, partner with mapping experts as much as you can before investing too much into your own mapping technology, because then you can focus your expertise on the business case that you're trying to solve for your company. So that would be my general advice.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're like huge believers in OSM as well. And I think my personal view is it's only sort of going to grow from here, from where it is. Obviously, it's seen massive growth. So yeah, I mean, we're pretty excited about the community as well. Okay, so I think we're pretty much coming to the end. I think we'll just focus on a bunch of Q&A now. There are quite a few from the audience. I don't think we can get to everyone. We'll do a few questions. I'm going to prioritize some of the people who've put in their names over anonymous questions. Okay, so in no particular order. Okay, there's an interesting one. Let's go with this from Ajay Patel, which is, what is your opinion on, it's an interesting one, which is ETAs for a drone delivery type scenario. So sort of how would you think about that problem? How would you solve? What would be parallels from, existing solution versus what you might have to build sort of yourself? I don't even know if you've given this question a thought before, but yeah, it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. Yeah, like, to be honest, like we are not there yet. Uber is not doing drone deliveries at this point, so we haven't had to deal with this problem yet. But if you think about it, like a drone goes like how it travels is like a bird, right? In mapping world, we call that like a Haversine distance or a Euclidean distance. So it's actually the most easiest to compute. If you have if you have two lat longs, computing the Haversine distance between those 2 points is just a mathematical formula, and you can produce that with pretty low latencies. But I can imagine. I wonder if we run into the same issues, like in a traditional mapping context, you have traffic, like you have people going at slower speeds than they should be. there's like road conditions changing. I wonder how the ecosystem will be when drone deliveries happen. Like, are there going to be traffic jams, or like they have to go at certain? So maybe you can take some parallels from the uh, pilot control that happens, or air traffic control that happens. Right. So I don't know if that level of sophistication will come up. Uh, but ultimately, if you're talking about ETA estimates, then it's a pretty that part is pretty straightforward.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there'll be quite a few interesting. Like one of the things I know some companies are trying to define is like these 3D corridors where like drones can operate. So I think it'll be a different kind of routing challenge as well. I don't think it'll be pure as the crow flies distance, but yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that goes. Okay, there's another interesting, I guess, tech slash party product question as well. It's from an anonymous attendee, which is what problems have you faced, or if you've thought about this problem where customers or riders are not comfortable with a map interface? For example, they're not able to identify location, not able to put a pin accurately. But obviously, we've discussed how the entire Uber experience or any ride sharing delivery experience is about maps. So have you thought about this problem where how do you solve for scenarios where users are not comfortable with maps?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm sure like a lot of us have faced this issue where you have your phone and your GPS signal has these two arrows going in direction, and you're turning around at the intersection trying to figure out which way you're facing along with your phone, right? So I think in general, I think a lot of mapping solutions have to be built not only to take you from point A to point B, but it also has to help the user orient themselves in the real world, right? So that they exactly understand which direction they're facing and which direction they're going at. And that if you build solutions to orient the user in the real world, then a lot of problems will be solved. And there can be various ways, right? I think a lot of companies have dealt with it differently, where you show a lot of contextual information about what's happening in the real world. For example, like even POI navigation is a very good example where you say, okay, instead of just turn right on blah blah street, you say turn right after this particular gas station or this particular mall, right? So that's one way to help users orient by providing them more contextual information. Similarly, you can say, okay, drop this passenger off on the right side of the street, right? That's a very, instead of saying drop them off at this address, you can say drop them off at the intersection of A street and B street, right? So a lot of these challenges, you need to provide more and more contextual information about the real world so that they're able to orient themselves in a very, like using English words or like POIs, make it as simple as possible for you users.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and I imagine because Uber operates in so many countries, like the level of sophistication with just tech itself, I imagine would be very different. So yeah, I'm sure you face some of these challenges in all kinds of contexts. So maybe we take the next question, which is actually this one seems interesting because it's very related to some of the points Naveen you mentioned. Again, by an anonymous attendee, which is I'm going to skip one part of the question. I'll cherry pick two parts of this question, which is how is it that you calculate walking paths? And what about parking spots data? Because obviously some of this is not very obvious, right? Like how do you calculate some of this information, especially I imagine parking spots. So again, any light you could throw on how people could approach a problem of this sort?
Yeah, I think for the walking path, it's it's one mode of transport, right? Like in general, when you're building a mapping solution, you want to build solutions for multi modes of transport, either that is walking, biking, or a car, or like in some cases transit and trucks as well, right? So once you have, and again, it depends on the use case. You don't want to invest in everything that you have. Like if you don't need to support that use case for your business, and once you invest in that, then the path computation for a walking path versus a car path is somewhat similar, but the cost functions might change. The speed at which they go, or like for example, on a car, the U-turn is very expensive, but with the walking, like the U-turn is not expensive, right? You can just turn around. So a lot of these things will change in terms of how the route is computed. But underlying thing is you need to have that information about whether there's a walking path or not. And similarly for parking spots, it again either like there's various ways, right? Like companies might end up using parking data that's available outside. Again, the question here comes back to like whether using existing providers versus building in-house, whether you have the ability to build that in-house as well. So you need to have that data first to be able to leverage that in your solution. So you need to identify like how you can get that parking data in the real world.
Great. Okay, so maybe we talk about another, I guess, very specific technical question. Again, it touches briefly upon some of what we discussed about like real-time challenges, etc., which is it's from M. Reza, which is, could you share more about the challenges of trying to estimate, I guess, speed or traffic in general and traffic prediction, and how do you do all this in real time, etc. So maybe, I guess you could interpret this question various different ways, but Naveen, maybe share some technical challenges that come with solving some of these problems in an Uber-like context.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in general, like some of you who are familiar with the mapping stack, mapping, if you're going to compute the best route and ETAs, there are various factors. And I imagine the question is more specific to traffic and how the traffic conditions are changing in real world, right? That is one of the key parameters that is used to compute the route that the driver has to take, right? And the challenge there is obviously it's in terms of how real time can you be, right? Like if these conditions are changing, and if you compute real time traffic, like let's say 5 minutes later, overall globally, then by the time like the congestion might have already eased. So in your app, you might show that the road is congested, but in reality, the road is already like congestion is already eased, right? So the ETA might be actually less than what you think it is. So being as near real time as possible is a challenge. And why is that is a challenge is because when you're operating globally, you're trying to deal with a lot of this kind of data, and to be able to compute that and understand the traffic speed that's happening in the real world is definitely a challenge. So you need really like very high computing power, obviously like and to be able to deploy that in real time and help make those route computations happen in real time as well. So I think scale is definitely the challenge. And the other challenges that you typically face with these kind of things is the quality of the data that you get as well. Because depending on like various GPS signals, it could be very noisy or it could be very accurate. So if your underlying source of truth is not accurate, then your whole computation on top of it is broken, right? So you want to make sure your foundations are strong as well.
Awesome. So I think Naveen, we're almost out of time in terms of the originally time we scheduled. I don't know, can you run 5 minutes over? There seems to be a lot of questions. I was wondering if we could take a couple more.
Yeah, absolutely. Not a problem for me.
Cool. Okay, let's take two or three more. And then maybe we'll just call it a day after. So maybe touching upon a different topic, which is so we've spoken quite a bit about ETAs routing. Let's talk about navigation. So why did Uber, again, comes from an anonymous attendee, why did Uber integrate the navigation product inside the driver app as opposed to building a standalone app?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if you think about Uber drivers experience, right, for a traditional Uber X, as I mentioned earlier, like drivers spend about 2/3 of their time navigating, right? And traditional Uber trip will have like the driver accepts a trip, and when they come to the pickup, they have to click pick up and then say, okay, start navigating. And then when they get to the drop off, they have to end the navigation and they say complete trip. So in a traditional Uber X, there is a various number of actions that the user has to take. And if you consider Uber Pool and all of these different things that are happening, the user has to do a lot of actions plus navigate while they're navigating, right? So the advantage of having in-app is so that they don't have to switch the app during their drive while they're driving, right? So you want to make it as stress-free as possible for your drivers, because if somebody is driving 8 hours a day, right, and then they're interacting, like they're staring at this tiny screen for the whole day, you want to make it as stress-free as possible so that it is safe for them. And at the end of the day, the less number of interactions they have with the app is more beneficial for us, and it's safer for them.
Awesome. So maybe again we'll take up we'll take one last question, and then I guess we'll sort of close this, which is Let's touch upon, I guess, a very different topic. Privacy. There seems to be a couple of questions around privacy, but maybe we'll take one of the questions here, which is, could you elaborate how privacy regulations would affect mapping APIs in the long term? I know there's obviously a lot of talk around privacy in different contexts. Obviously, the Facebook and Apple thing made a lot of news. Also, Android, iOS are trying to sort of, I guess, restrict the amount of location data you can track about users. So what's your thought on, I guess, how privacy in general and how that evolves over time, how that would affect your mapping platform?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously this is a huge topic right now, like in the last few years, right? So any mapping company should be careful when they're dealing with users' data. Like that's given, right? And if you think about it, for the most part, like you can get away without having any user signal. Like as long as you have the where you want to go and what's happening in the real world, like what's the road conditions, what's the traffic conditions, you're able to compute without using any of the user's personal information, right? I would say like always tilt towards that. And obviously, like when you're collecting the location in order to compute anything, like you want to make sure it's anonymized. Like there's no reason to use the user's information apart from their lat and long, right? So you want to anonymize that data as much as possible. And so that you're not going into the realm of understanding where the user is going into too much detail. So I think that's something like you have to keep that in mind from the beginning, because if you retroactively try to do that, it'll be a nightmare. So privacy should be a key topic from the beginning if you're building a mapping stack.
Yeah, and I think obviously, I think historically it was sort of privacy was never such a concern, or at least it was not such an active concern as it is now. And I'm sure this will impact, and people will be a lot more conscious, as you said, about doing privacy first design. Uh, there's tons of questions actually. I know we're out of time and I want to be respectful of Naveen's time as well. Actually, there's all kinds of interesting questions on Kepler GL, about like how do you improve GPS accuracy. Actually, sorry guys, we can't take more questions. Try to answer whatever we can, I guess, offline. But yeah, Naveen, thank you so much. Do you have sort of any closing comments for companies where, hey, I mean, if you're looking to do something, hey, you should definitely do, or like resources that, hey, you know what, if you're new to maps and you're doing something in transport logistics, hey, check out ABC. This would be a good way for you to get started.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first of all, like a message to the people that are here is, first of all, if you're trying to build mapping solution, always think from the customer perspective, because it's a very generic advice, but it applies so much here as well. Because ultimately, the kind like mapping is a tool to help you provide the best experience for your users, right? So think of your metrics, what you're trying to optimize for from a user perspective. Like how can you make the rider pickup experience better? How can you make the driver experience less stressful? And then work backwards from there. I think you will end up in the right direction, regardless of what you use in the backend, right? So I think that would be my number one advice to all the people who are trying to invest in mapping tech. In terms of resources, I think obviously, like as I mentioned earlier, OSRM is a great way to bootstrap. And mapping in general is a very close-knit company. Like there are very few companies that are doing mapping tech full stack, right? So like NextBillion or Uber, there's a lot of blog posts that we write. So I think those, if you go to eng.uber.com, then that's a very great resource. There are a few articles on maps as well. I know, like Gaurav, you've written a couple of articles that have been like really good source for me as well. So I would say like start there, and see how these companies are providing mapping services for their customers.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, I can attest to the value I got when I was starting off in maps from all the Uber blog posts, especially because, I mean, while there was some traditional stuff on here, Dijkstra and contraction hierarchies, whatever, but like really applying it at scale, how to think about it in a very different context. I think the Uber blogs, and it was incredibly helpful. So I know we've come to the end of this webinar. So thank you so much, Naveen, and thank you so much everyone in the audience for making this super engaging, and also Naveen just for being extremely transparent. I understand, like obviously you can't share anything, like hey, we use XYZ model and ABC algorithms, but again, thank you so much for being as transparent as you could be. So yeah, and thank you everyone in the audience. We hope to do this on a more regular basis. And if you have any suggestions, comments, or topics that you would like us to sort of, have more speakers in the future, do reach out to us, and we would love to see how we can make this as engaging as possible for everyone. So thank you so much. Really enjoyed doing this, and yeah, hope to make this as engaging all the future webinars as well. Thank you so much, Naveen.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gaurav, for hosting me. And I really loved the questions from the audience. We have a super technical audience here, and they've asked very detailed questions. Enjoyed them. Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And then please feel like just tag us on LinkedIn if you have any questions. And then reach out to us on LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. We'll see however we can engage and even answer some of these questions. Thank you so much, everyone.